Okay, guys, we're gonna get going with chapter 29 here, which is Woodrow Wilson's presidency to World War One. I'm getting this done so you guys can get that information for our quiz next week. I'll be out Friday and Monday, but this will keep us on pace. So Woodrow Wilson is known, right, for being an idealist. Wilsonian idealism, all that sort of stuff is sort of famous for Woodrow Wilson, and we'll talk about why that is. And we can make other connections to other presidents and see if we can get to that without me making them for you while we're talking. So Woodrow Wilson, right, second Democratic president in 1861, realize, right, this is a Republican dominance politically through this time period. He's only really elected because Teddy Roosevelt splits the vote with Howard Taft. As you can see here, right, Wilson's admiration for the Confederate attempted independence inspired his ideal of self-determination. His ideal and faith in the masses, right, and properly informed, came from Jeffersonian democracy. I guess I make the connection to Jefferson here. A lot of Thomas Jefferson ideals with Wilson. Also, Wilson is from Virginia, so he probably grew up idolizing Jefferson, I would imagine. His inspirational political sermons reflected influence of his Presbyterian minister father. Even though Wilson will go on to be more of an academic, he'll famously be the president of Princeton University. Wilson is going to have his political program, which is going to be similar to Teddy Roosevelt's and not necessarily Howard Taft's, but it's going to be called the New Freedom, right? And his idea here is he wants to take on what he called the triple wall of privileges, which was the tariff, the bank, and the trusts. Okay. Part of this will be landmark tax legislation that comes up during his presidency. So they'll pass the 16th Amendment, which is going to create the income tax. Okay. So moderate levy on incomes over $3,000. The average person during this time period only made $740. So they're only really going to tax the rich at this point. By 1970, revenue from income tax shot ahead of revenue from the tariffs. So really up to this point, the main way that the government made money was through tariffs and the sale of lands. And now the income tax becomes the main way that the government makes money. If you just Google search like presidential budget, you'll see what the government plans to do with all the money, right? You'll see the vast majority of it is defense spending, but that is the idea of like most of that comes from income tax. So Wilson's program, one, the Underwood tariff, right? The Underwood tariff is going to attack the already established tariff. But what you're going to see here, right, is it's going to reduce the rates, reduce the fees. And yet again, this harkens back to what we were talking about before of earlier, sort of pre-Civil War ideas of the tariff is bad for the common person. Wilson appeared personally before Congress to get sweeping bank reform, endorsed Democratic proposals for a decentralized bank, opposed Republican demand for a high private bank with 15 branches. What the Federal Reserve Act is going to do is create a series of banks. I think it's 12 or 13. I don't remember what it is that are going to be spread around the country in the form of a central bank. And when it says Wilson appealed to the sovereign people, he's basically like going to try to popularize the idea of a central bank. Outside of that, the other thing he's going to do is he's going to appeal to Congress, all that sort of stuff. And the hope is this would help to stabilize currency, right? The Federal Reserve is basically a bank for banks. And so the idea is it would be able to stop runs on banks, which were basically causing banks to go out of business. It won't be like super successful, as we'll see some of the stuff with the Great Depression and how they'll fight that. But that was the idea. This came out, there's another one of those financial panics in like 1907 or something like that. And that was what pushed this. But yet again, it wasn't what the Republicans wanted with a private bank with 15 branches. This is going to be a government bank, and it will help to stabilize the currency. Federal Trade Commission Act in 1914, presidentially appointed commission could research industries engaged in interstate commerce and help to regulate industry by rooting out unfair trade practices. Clinton Antitrust Act is another thing that was yet again created to help regulate trusts. Federal Loan Act, Warehousing Act, right? Both of these are populist ideas that the Democrats, remember, had jumped onto. So more credit for farmers at low rates, authorized loans for security for stable crops. Limit on Wilson's progressivism is going to be unfortunately, civil rights. One of the main things here, one of the main problems, yet again, is that Wilson was a Southerner who did not have the sort of equality ideas when it came to civil rights as others. Um, you can see here the Birth of a Nation movie poster here. It had a different name, like, like Yay Yay Knights of the, oh, here it is. The Fiery Cross of the Ku Klux Klan is what I think it was originally called. You can see it on the poster. And people were like kind of iffy on that, so they changed the name to The Birth of the Nation. But it's a movie about like how the Ku Klux Klan was like the heroes of Reconstruction. And Wilson famously like had a showing of it at the White House, right? So it just shows you how he was out of touch with civil rights and better treatment for African Americans. In contrast to Roosevelt and Taft's policy, right, he recoiled at the idea of aggressive foreign policy. He didn't like imperialism. He didn't like dollar diplomacy. And so what we're going to get is what was referred to as moral diplomacy. And moral diplomacy is super idealistic, much like when we were talking about Jefferson. It's not going to be as practical, right, as other things. And what we mean by moral diplomacy is this idea that Wilson was trying to push the ideas of like freedom and democracy to other countries. And so in the end, the idea was is that we're going to aid countries that adopt democratic ideals and not help countries that are not democratic. But the hope was is that we would shift countries to become more democratic, and as we'll see, that's not going to really be the case under his diplomacy. You can see here, uh, we have the canal completed during Wilson's presidency, started under Teddy Roosevelt. Famously, Wilson pressed a button from his desk in Washington, D.C., which blew up the levee, which created this man-made lake between the two regions of the canal. Also, as you can see here, all the troop interventions throughout the Caribbean during this time period. So, you know, everyone's form of diplomacy ended up getting involved, it seems like, with different aspects of either money or troop involvement. Wilson of Mexico, right? Wilson again refused to practice diplomacy of his predecessors. Didn't want to intervene in Mexico, so he's tried to steal his moral course. He didn't recognize Victoriano Huerta's regime, right? And basically aided the rivals of Huerta, right, with Carranza and Pancho Villa. There will be a hot point at the port of Tampico where some sailors are going to be off leave and they get into a kerfluffle. Um, this then leads people to want to like get engaged in fighting Mexico again. Luckily, Brazil, Argentina, and Chile come to mediate the situation, and it calms it down. Huerta, right, his government collapses in July 1914, basically because it wasn't super popular, and that leaves Carranza to take over the government. Pancho Villa, right, is his chief rival, and basically going to be like fight a guerrilla war against Carranza, part of which, excuse me, will be to attack American interests as well. So he'll kill 16 mining engineers who are traveling through northern Mexico and even invade the southern reaches of New Mexico and murder another 19 Americans. This causes Wilson to mobilize General Pershing to chase Pancho Villa. Pershing will never catch Pancho Villa, but he will chase him around New Mexico, or around Mexico, until he gets the word it's time to head to France for World War I. Wilson, right? Basically, we'll talk about World War I more in class, but the outbreak of World War I was caused by basically the imperialistic pressures of the time, right? Old Kaiser Wilhelm here was jealous of his cousin, I don't remember if it's Edward or George, but the King of England, and he wanted a navy like his, right? So he built up the German navy, right, to compete with the English navy. And the Englishmen were like, well, we got to make a better navy. And you see this like competing aspect between these countries, right? So it was kind of a matter of time until it boiled over. Um, the assassination of the Archduke and all that stuff we'll talk about in class. But with the start of the war, right, most Americans, right, were anti-German from the outset. Not all of them, but the majority, right. Generally speaking, Wilhelm was seen as arrogant and autocratic, right, and that doesn't follow Wilson's ideals. Impression strengthened by the German ruthless strike at neutral Belgium. So eventually, right, when we get the invasion of France, it's going to be with the Schlieffen Plan, and the idea is that they're going to swing through Belgium, which is also what they do in World War II. British imposed blockades with mines and ships across the North Sea. Berlin announced submarine warfare around the British Isle. What's going to be interesting is the submarine was kind of new, not new, and like it wasn't new in the sense of like it didn't exist before, but now it was like a more, it wasn't like a Civil War era submarine where everybody was going to die on it, right? And so the Germans actually utilized the submarines as a way to inflict heavy damages on the Allied shipping, and they really felt like it was like an Uber weapon. Like they began to invest more and more in it because it was so costly to take out their big like battleships, like say the Bismarck or whatever. So new submarines not fit existing international laws, right? What the way it used to work was that like the submarines were supposed to like surface and say, "Hey, you guys have like 20 minutes, and then we're going to sink you," and that isn't going to be. It's going to basically like give up the submarine's position, right? And so what happens is the submarines become ultra ruthless, right? They're going to try to sink ships, and then if other ships come to their aid, they're going to sink them too. At the time, most of the torpedo firing had to be done at depth, but they would have a cannon on the ship that they could fire when it was out of the water. And so the Germans are going to be very big into submarine warfare. Posed a threat to the United States as long as Wilson intended on maintaining American neutrality. Berlin officials declared that they could not sink neutral shipping, but warned mistakes would occur. Wilson decided on calculated risk, claimed profitable neutral trading rights while hoping no incidents would cause war. So yeah, we were trading with both sides, not wanting to get involved. And there's going to just be growing and mounting pressure for the United States to come in on the side of the Allies. What's going to happen, right? And we'll talk about it here. I think in the next slide is you're going to have the sinking of the Lusitania here, right off the coast of Ireland. The Lusitania was sailing from New York, heading for Liverpool up in here. And what's going to happen is they felt like the Lusitania was the fastest, what's it called? Ocean liner, right? So if you think of cruise ships today, those are designed for like comfort and fun, where an ocean liner was supposed to be fast, right? And so it's not maybe as comfortable as say a cruise ship. So like sailing across the Atlantic, right? The Lusitania is going to do that like in, I think it's like 5 days or something like that. And it would maybe not be, what do you call it? Super comfortable, right? They still had, entertaining stuff to do, but it wasn't like it wasn't completely entertainment like say a cruise. Now, what's going to happen with the Lusitania is the Lusitania isn't going to be able to sail as fast as it wants to, right? The Cunard shipping line decided that of the, like, you can see the three smokestacks here on it, they weren't going to run one of the boilers, right, for the steam. And so the Lusitania was sailing, like, I want to say it could sail like 24 knots or something like that, but it was sailing like at 20 or 21 or 19, somewhere in there. And so it wasn't going as fast as they thought it would. And part of the reason people thought it was unsinkable, not necessarily unsinkable, but it wouldn't be sunk, was that it would be able to outrun the U-boats. But what happened is it didn't. And Eric Larson, our Devil in the White City author, wrote a really good book called Dead Wake about the sinking of the Lusitania. And really, it's like a convergence of like three or four things that happen like to come together for them to sink the Lusitania. The U-boat that runs into the Lusitania was on its way back thinking it wasn't going to sink anything and just kind of happened into the Lusitania in the fog, and then the fog breaks and they hit it with a torpedo that hits like the perfect spot and explodes and causes an explosion on the inside of the Lusitania, where most ships during this time period, if they sank, it took hours, and the Lusitania sank in like 15 minutes. And the water degrees was like, it was like 45, 50 degrees in the water. And so people died from hypothermia from sitting in the water waiting for safety. But let's get back to the notes here. So German U-boats, right, basically began to say, hey, we're going to start sinking all sorts of ships. One of the things was the Lusitania, as it says right here, had small arms on it, and that kind of gave them rationale. Um, and so, that gave them legitimacy in their mind. But there was actually all sorts of rules about the stuff they could carry and stuff, and we could talk about it in class. Um, what's going to happen is that even though Americans shocked by and angered by this, they didn't like Wilson doesn't declare war after the Lusitania sinking. The Germans had actually like posted in the newspaper that you don't need to be going on these boats, like you're gonna get sunk, don't do it, and people ignored it. Um, what happens after this is they move from this type of like, we're only going to sink, British ships or whatever. They moved to like unrestricted warfare where like they started sinking any ship that was going into Britain. And that combined with the Zimmerman telegram are going to be what drive the United States into World War II, or excuse me, into World War I.